"What are you doing here? Women don't know a thing about fighter jets." The taunts echoed through the crowd as Emily Harper stood quietly, blending into the sea of spectators, just another unremarkable civilian. They had no clue that over a decade ago she was a Top Gun legend who had buried her past in the shadows. But when the piercing wail of emergency sirens cut through the air and an F-22 began its uncontrolled spiral, a young pilot's desperate SOS crackling over the radio, a name long thought forgotten resurfaced. Harper, Phantom, back in the cockpit. Emily stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of her worn gray hoodie, her dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail. The coastal sun blazed down on the air show, the crowd buzzing with excitement. Kids pointing at the jets, screaming across the sky. To them, she was nothing special, just a woman in faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, no polish, no flair. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were fixed on the heavens, tracking the F-22's sleek lines as it sliced through the clouds. She'd been coming to these air shows for years, always lingering at the edges, never speaking. Nobody knew her. Nobody bothered to. But today, something felt off. Her fingers tightened around a small keychain in her pocket, a tiny metal jet, the only relic of her Navy days she allowed herself to keep. A vendor nearby, a middle-aged man with a red neck and a booming voice, was peddling airshow t-shirts. His booth was mobbed with buyers. Spotting Emily standing alone, he rolled his eyes. "Hey, lady, you lost?" he shouted, waving a shirt like a banner. "This ain't a meditation class." The crowd around him snickered, heads swiveling to stare. Emily's fingers paused on the keychain, her gaze flicking to him briefly. She didn't respond, just shifted her stance and returned her eyes to the sky. The vendor scoffed, muttering to a customer, "Some people just don't fit in." His words lingered, sharp and thoughtless, but Emily's face remained steady, her focus unyielding. The air show was a spectacle. Families sprawled on picnic blankets, vendors hawking popcorn and cheap plastic flags. Emily had woven through the throng, finding a spot near the field's edge close enough to see the runway, far enough to avoid notice. She preferred it that way, out of the spotlight, just another face. For 10 years, she'd lived in this quiet coastal town, teaching yoga at a local community center, her life calm and predictable. No one asked about her past. No one needed to. But the jets soaring above stirred something deep within her, something she'd locked away long ago. She shifted her weight, her sneakers grinding into the gravel, and let her gaze drift to the horizon. A young girl, maybe 10, stood nearby with her father, clutching a toy jet. She pointed at Emily, her voice curious but carrying. "Daddy, why is she here all by herself? She doesn't even look like she cares about planes." Her father, a stocky man in a polo shirt, glanced at Emily and shrugged. "Probably just lost, kiddo. Doesn't know what's happening." The girl nodded, satisfied, and darted off for ice cream. Emily's grip tightened on the keychain, its edges pressing into her palm. She took a slow breath, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she stayed silent, her focus locked on the F-22 looping high above. Then it happened. A sharp crack tore through the air, like a whip snapping. The crowd gasped as the F-22 wobbled, its sleek frame tilting unnaturally. Black smoke streamed from one engine. The radio tower crackled with the young pilot's voice, cutting through the chaos. "Mayday, mayday. I've lost control." Panic surged through the crowd. A mother yanked her child close, clutching his hand. A man in a baseball cap yelled, "It's gonna crash." Emily's head snapped up, her body going rigid. Her hand squeezed the keychain so tightly it bit into her skin. The jet spiraled lower, a dark streak against the blue sky. Hey, if this story's grabbing you, take a second to grab your phone. Hit that like button. Drop a comment below, tell me what's hitting home. And if you're craving more stories like this, ones that dig deep and hold tight, hit subscribe. It keeps this going. All right, back to Emily. The crowd was in pandemonium now, people shoving, some sprinting for cover. A group of young guys in flashy sunglasses stood nearby, their laughter slicing through the noise. One of them, tall with a smug grin, pointed at Emily. Yo, what's she staring at? Think she's gonna fix that jet with her yoga poses? His friend snickered, tossing empty soda cans into a pile. Another, shorter, with a gold chain gleaming, leaned in. Bet she doesn't even know what an F-22 is. Probably here for the food trucks. The words stung, but Emily didn't react. Her eyes stayed on the jet, her jaw clenched. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the keychain again, and stepped closer to the barrier. A woman in a volunteer vest, clipboard in hand, approached Emily with a tight smile and a syrupy tone. "Excuse me, ma'am, this area's for VIPs and staff only." "You're not on the list, are you?" She tilted her head, her eyes raking over Emily's plain clothes with clear disdain. Nearby spectators smirked, waiting for Emily to retreat. Emily met her gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm where I need to be," she said, her voice quiet but firm, and turned back to the sky. The volunteer's smile wavered, her pen hovering over the clipboard, but she backed off, muttering about civilians. An older man, a retired pilot with a weathered face and a navy cap, stood a few feet away. He'd been watching Emily, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place her. He leaned toward his friend, his voice low but audible. "Heard she tried Top Gun once. Couldn't cut it. Washed out early. Shame." His friend nodded, sipping a beer. "Figures. Doesn't look like she belongs." Emily's lips tightened into a thin line. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. But her shoulders squared slightly, and she took another step toward the runway. A woman in a vibrant sundress, her coral-painted nails flashing, pushed through the crowd with a plastered-on smile. She thrived on attention, always aware of who was watching. She stopped near Emily, eyeing her up and down with a wrinkled nose. "Sweetie, this isn't your place," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You'd be better off, I don't know, knitting or something soft like that." The crowd around her laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. Emily's hand stilled in her pocket. She turned just enough to meet the woman's eyes. "Knitting's honest work," she said, her voice low and steady. The woman blinked, caught off guard, and turned away, muttering to her friend. The siren screamed louder now, the F-22's spiral tightening. The commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, stormed out of the control tower, his face flushed. "Is there anyone here who can fly a Raptor?" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. The crowd fell silent, heads turning, eyes searching. No one moved. No one spoke. Emily's gaze sharpened, the softness in her eyes replaced by something fierce, like a blade catching the light. She stepped over the barrier, her sneakers hitting the asphalt with purpose. The crowd parted, bewildered, watching this unassuming woman stride toward the control room like she owned it. A news reporter, her hair stiff with spray and her microphone gripped tightly, spotted Emily moving through the crowd. She nudged her cameraman, her voice sharp with excitement. "Get this, some nobody thinks she's a hero. Zoom in." The camera swung toward Emily, capturing her plain hoodie and steady gait. The reporter leaned into her mic, her tone mocking. "Looks like we've got an aspiring pilot, folks. Probably can't tell the cockpit from the cargo bay." The crowd tittered, phones raised to record. Emily didn't falter, though her fingers brushed the keychain again, her lips tightening briefly before she pushed open the control room door. The young guys by the barrier erupted in laughter. The tall one cupped his hands around his mouth. "What, you gonna save the day, yoga lady?" His friend with the gold chain doubled over, wheezing. "She's gonna crash that jet worse than it's already crashing." Emily didn't glance back. Her steps were steady, her hands loose at her sides. The retired pilot watched her go, his beer frozen halfway to his mouth. Something about her calm, deliberate movement made him pause. He leaned forward, squinting, as if trying to pull a memory from the haze. Inside the control room, the air was thick with tension. Officers scrambled, radios crackling, screens flashing red. A major, his uniform pristine and his ego sharper, spun around as Emily entered. He was the type who loved his own voice, quick to dismiss anyone who didn't fit his mold. He looked at her, his lip curling. "Don't tell me she's volunteering. She's past her prime. Look at her, she's been out of the game for years." A younger officer, wiry and ambitious, chimed in, his voice cutting. 12 years away from the stick. "She can't fly a kite, let alone a raptor." Murmurs spread through the room, heads shaking. "Don't add to the chaos," someone muttered. "Let the real pros handle it." A tech at a nearby console, his glasses fogged with sweat, glanced up as Emily passed. He whispered to his colleague, loud enough for her to hear. "Bet she's just here for the spotlight. Probably saw it on TV and wants to be famous." His colleague smirked, tapping his screen. "Yeah, she's gonna get someone killed." Emily's hand paused on the doorframe, her knuckles whitening for a moment. Then she let go, her face calm, and kept moving. The techs exchanged a look, their smirks fading as she didn't even glance their way. Her focus locked on the commander's desk. Emily didn't stop. She walked straight to the desk, her hand reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small, worn leather case and flipped it open. The Top Gun instructor badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its edges worn but the name clear, Emily Harper. The room fell silent. The commander, a grizzled man with gray at his temples, stared at the badge, then at her. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "My God, you're Harper. The one who downed 7 targets in training." Emily met his eyes, her face unreadable. "No time," she said. "Open the hangar." The major's mouth opened, then closed. The younger officer stepped back, his smirk gone. Slowly, reluctantly, they moved aside. The hangar was a cavern of steel and noise techs rushing, tools clattering. Emily strode toward the backup F-22, her sneakers echoing on the concrete. A technician, a wiry man with grease-stained hands, looked up from the jet's panel. He snorted, shaking his head. "This jet's next gen. She won't keep up. No way." Another tech, older with a permanent scowl, muttered, 12 years gone. Her reflexes are shot." A young soldier, barely out of training, stood by the cockpit, his face hard. "If she screws this up, that kid dies with her." The words hung heavy, the crowd outside pressing closer, their eyes sharp like daggers. Emily climbed into the cockpit, her movements smooth, practiced. She strapped in, her hands steady, and looked up at the sky through the canopy. Her grip tightened on the stick. An older woman, a base employee with a lanyard swinging from her neck, stood at the hangar's edge, arms crossed. She'd been at the base for decades, seen pilots come and go. She leaned toward a coworker, her voice sharp. "That's her, the one they're letting fly. Looks like she'd faint at a paper cut." The coworker, a young man with a buzz cut, laughed nervously, glancing at Emily as she adjusted her helmet. "Yeah, this is a mistake. She'd choke under pressure." Emily's fingers paused on the straps, her eyes flicking toward them for a split second. She said nothing, just pulled the straps tighter, her jaw set. The radio crackled, the young pilot's voice breaking through, high and panicked. "I can't hold it. It's going down." Emily flipped switches, the HUD flaring to life. Her voice came through the radio, calm and clear. "Listen to me. Follow my every move. I'll get you home." The young pilot's breathing hitched, but he managed a shaky, "Yes, ma'am." Outside, the crowd was a mix of fear and skepticism. A ground officer, his face flushed, shouted into his headset, "Too late. They'll both go up in flames." Another voice, shrill with panic, cut in. She'd die just like him. Some turned away, hands over their mouths, unable to watch. Emily's jaw tightened. She muttered, low enough for only herself to hear, "I lost 12 years. I won't lose another soul." A teenage boy, part of a school group touring the base, stood on the sidelines, his phone raised to record. He nudged his friend, his voice smug. "Check it out, some lady thinks she's Jake Stone. This is gonna be a disaster." His friend laughed, zooming in on Emily's jet as it taxied. "Yeah, she's about to make a fool of herself. Bet it's trending by tonight." Their teacher, a weary-looking woman, overheard but didn't correct them, her frown deepening. Emily's jet rolled past, the roar of the engines drowning out their words. Her hand rested on the throttle, steady, unmoved by the noise around her. The F-22 roared to life, the engine screaming as Emily taxied to the runway. The crowd held its breath, the jet's sleek frame gleaming under the sun. She launched, the force pinning her back, but her hands were steady, her eyes locked on the spiraling jet above. The crippled F-22 was a wreck fire spitting from its wing, smoke trailing like a wound. Emily's jet closed in, her voice steady over the radio. "Match my climb. Stay with me." The young pilot's jet wobbled, but he followed, his breathing ragged. Emily's hands moved like they'd never left the controls, every motion precise, every adjustment flawless. She flew wing to wing, a deadly shadow maneuver, guiding the crippled jet into a stable orbit. A security guard near the runway leaned against a barrier, his radio crackling with updates. He shook his head, speaking to another guard. "She's got no business up there. 12 years out, she's rusty as hell." The other guard nodded, chewing gum. "Yeah, if she screws this up, it's on her. That kid's done for." Their words carried to the nearby crowd, who shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement. Emily's jet climbed higher, her silhouette a dark speck against the smoke. Her hands didn't shake. Her focus didn't waver. The guards' radios went silent, their faces tightening as they watched her jet close the gap. The base below was chaos, people shouting, officers barking orders. The major from the control room stood frozen, arms crossed, watching the screens. The younger officer beside him wiped sweat from his brow, muttering, "She's actually doing it." The retired pilot, still clutching his beer, pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide. "That's her," he said to no one in particular. "That's Phantom." A woman in the crowd, her face pale, clutched her husband's arm. "Who is she?" she whispered. The retired pilot didn't answer, just stared at the sky, his hands trembling. Emily's jet was a blur now, the two F-22s locked in a dance no one thought possible. Warning alarms screamed in her cockpit, red lights flashing. The young pilot's voice came through, weaker now. "I can't. It's burning badly." Emily's voice didn't waver. "You can. You will. Pull left now." He did, his jet lurching but holding. She mirrored him, her jet so close their wings nearly touched. The crowd below was silent, every eye on the sky. The ground officer who'd shouted earlier stood rooted, his headset dangling in his hand. "She's insane," he whispered, but there was no venom now, only awe. A medic standing ready with her team near the runway watched the jets, her jaw clenched. She turned to her partner, her voice low. "If she pulls this off, I'll eat my kid. No way she's got the nerve for this." Her partner, a younger woman, nodded, her eyes wide. "She's gonna crash, and we'll be cleaning up the mess." The medic's words were sharp, but her hands trembled as she checked her bag, her eyes flicking back to the sky. Emily's jet banked sharply, the crippled F-22 following, its flames flickering but holding steady. The medic's hands stilled, her breath catching as the jets descended. The crippled F-22 wobbled, flames licking its side. Emily's voice remained steady, guiding the young pilot through every move. "Ease back. Let me take the lead." The runway loomed closer, the crowd holding its breath. The backup F-22 touched down first, a perfect landing, skidding to a stop. The crippled jet followed, its landing gear screeching, smoke pouring as it hit the asphalt. Emergency crews sprinted forward, foam spraying, sirens wailing. The crowd erupted, cheers and gasps blending into a roar. Emily unstrapped, her breath heavy, and climbed out. Her legs shook as she hit the ground, but she stood tall, her eyes scanning the runway. A base photographer, his camera slung around his neck, had been snapping shots of the chaos. He lowered his lens, shaking his head at a colleague. "She got lucky. No way she's the real deal. Probably just rode someone else's plan." His colleague, a younger guy, nodded, scrolling through his photos. "Yeah, bet she's milking this for fame. Watch her post about it later." The photographer raised his camera again, but his hands hesitated as Emily walked past, her face pale but composed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The crowd parted for her, their cheers fading into a hush. The young pilot stumbled out of his jet, his face pale, his flight suit singed. He looked at Emily, his eyes wide with something like reverence. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. She nodded once and turned away. The crowd was still cheering, but the mocking voices, the sneers, were gone. The tall guy with the sunglasses stood at the barrier, his grin long gone. His friend with the gold chain looked at the ground, kicking at a pebble. The woman in the sundress clutched her purse, her face flushed, avoiding Emily's direction. A local journalist, her notebook filled with scribbles, stood among the crowd, her pen still. She turned to a bystander, her voice skeptical. "She's no hero. Probably just in the right place at the right time." The bystander, an older man with a baseball cap, shrugged. "Yeah, anyone could have done that with enough luck." Their words carried, But Emily didn't hear. She paused by the runway's edge, her hand brushing the keychain in her pocket. She looked at the young pilot, now surrounded by medics, and her shoulders relaxed slightly before she kept walking. Emily staggered, her breath coming in short gasps. She took a step, then another, her knees buckling. The runway blurred, the world tilting. She hit the ground, her hands scraping the asphalt. Medics rushed forward, shouting, but she waved them off, her voice weak. "I'm fine." They didn't listen, lifting her onto a stretcher, her protests fading as the world went dark. The crowd watched, silent now, their faces a mix of shock and shame. The retired pilot pushed forward, his navy cap clutched in his hands. "I knew it," he muttered. "I knew it was her." When Emily opened her eyes, sunlight streamed through a window, and the barracks were quiet except for the hum of a fan. She lay on a cot, her flight suit gone, replaced with a plain t-shirt and sweats. Her hand brushed the keychain, now resting on a table beside her. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked out the window. The runway was empty now, the jets gone, the crowd dispersed, but something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. The door opened and the commander stepped in, his face softer than before. Behind him, the hallway was lined with pilots and Marines, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn. Emily stood, her legs unsteady but her back straight. The commander cleared his throat. "Captain Harper," he said, his voice carrying. "You saved that boy's life. You saved that jet." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You're still one of us." Emily's breath caught, her hand closing around the keychain. She didn't speak, just nodded, her eyes bright. A young Marine, barely out of training, stood at the front of the formation, his hands shaking as he held his salute. He'd been one of the loudest doubters earlier, his voice carrying over the radio about her fossilized reflexes. Now he stepped forward, his voice low but clear. "Ma'am, I was wrong. I'm sorry." His eyes met hers, then dropped to the floor. Emily looked at him, her expression soft but firm. She gave a small nod, her hand slipping into her pocket, and turned back to the commander. The Marine stepped back, his face burning, but his salute held firm. The commander stepped aside, and the formation outside snapped to attention. 500 men and women pilots, ground crew stood in perfect rows. In unison, they saluted, their hands sharp against their brows. Emily's throat tightened. She stepped to the door, her sneakers silent on the floor. She looked at them, these strangers who'd mocked her, doubted her, dismissed her. Now they stood for her. The young soldier who'd warned she'd fail was there, his face red, his eyes down. The technician who'd called her reflexes fossilized stood rigid, his salute steady. Emily didn't smile, didn't wave. She just stood there, her presence enough. The major from the control room was nowhere to be seen. Word spread later that he'd been relieved of duty. His career stalled for his reckless judgment. The younger officer, who'd sneered about paper planes, faced a formal review, his promotion delayed indefinitely. The woman in the sundress, a local influencer, found her latest sponsorship deal canceled after a video of her mocking Emily went viral, her followers turning on her. The tall guy with the sunglasses slipped away, but his buddies didn't let him forget. Their group chat buzzed with jabs about his loud mouth. The retired pilot, though, stood at the edge of the formation, his cap back on, his eyes proud. He'd been wrong, but he'd own it. Emily walked out of the barracks, the salute still holding. She didn't look back. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her hand slipping the keychain back into her pocket. The coastal breeze hit her face, carrying the faint roar of a jet taking off in the distance. She paused, her eyes lifting to the sky. For 12 years, she'd hidden, carried the weight of her past in silence. She'd been judged, dismissed, torn down. But today, she'd flown again, and the world had seen her. Nobody needed to say it. The truth was there in the silence of the crowd, in the weight of that salute. Emily kept walking, her sneakers steady on the asphalt. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had never been. The sky knew her name, and now so did they. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, this one's for you. You stood your ground, even when it hurt. You carried on, even when they laughed. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.